So firstly, thank you to the committees for allowing me to speak. I'm going to start with admitting two things. One is I'm not an expert in human behaviour change, and I know a few people have already said that. I really mean it. I'm not. But the work that I do is naturally evolved to absolutely identify that a human behaviour change is core to the work that we do. So I'm going to be talking through the experiences that I've had, and particularly looking at empathy. And not just empathy between perhaps the trainer and the participant, but that empathetic connection between the participant and the animal, and how we can harness that and try and get a behaviour change and improve animal care through it. And secondly, these are just experiences, so I've been really impressed by the passionate and really impressive presentations so far that have been given on human behaviour change that really truly made a difference to animal welfare, and so I hope that we are also moving in the right direction. Am I pressing the wrong button?
Yep, that should be the right button. Oh, hang on, it's because this is not plugged in.
Just use this for a sec.
Can that not count as my time? Thanks.
You're all right, you're fine.
Okay, so I'm going to rush through quickly. As you probably guessed by the pictures, we're not talking about horses, dogs, or cats today. Talking about wild welfare, which works with zoos and aquariums. Wild Welfare is a very small organisation. There's literally actually just two of us. And our vision is to end the suffering of captive wild animals around the world, ensuring full and sustainable protection is given to all animals in human care. And this is one of the definitions that we use to define and determine which facilities we might work with. Our team is made up of ex-zoo personnel who collectively have over 65 years of experience in the industry. Now, this is really important. We do work with the modern zoo community. We find that by working with them and not criticising them, we're going to get further. However, we do not defend the indefensible. So if we find a welfare practice both within the modern zoo community or the substandard zoo community that we disagree with, we will challenge that, but we'll try and do it in a constructive and beneficial manner that will both benefit the humans we're working with, but also the animals. So very briefly, what does the landscape look like in the zoos and aquariums for animal welfare? Splitting it up into an accredited zoo community and the non-accredited zoo community, where accreditation means an institution has a given set of welfare standards it should adhere to. It's still really complex. There's 282 direct members of the World Association of Zoos and Aquariums, 1,300 approximately associate members through their regional associations such as BIAZA or AZA. And these represent, BIAZA or AZA represent a single country, but they can also represent a number of countries like the European Zoo Association. And underneath them, they have other national associations like the German Zoo Association, and there's about 1,000 sort of institutions within those national zoo associations. I can see you're all keeping up there. And then on top of that, there's 6,000 plus facilities that are non-accredited. And even within the accredited zoo community, there's varying standards of welfare. So we then define captivity as isn't inherently bad, but is actually very frequently bad. We think approximately, out of those approximately 10,000 zoos out there, 80% of them fall into a category of very poor welfare, while only 5%, which is about 400, fall into a category of good welfare. And the problem remains that the number of poor welfare category zoos is actually increasing, not decreasing, as a number of sort of developing countries try and attain animals and collections that the Western society has previously dictated. So our efforts are needed even more to try and apply high standards of care. How do we choose a facility to work with? Well, we look at feasibility. We look at current ownership, if it's government owned, if it's privately owned, whether we can get access, whether there's legislation constraints, or whether there's legislation that can actually support the work that we're doing. And we look at the infrastructure, both management and resource infrastructure, but also the people infrastructure. Who are the individuals that we can influence? Who are looking like they want to make the change happen? We obviously also respond to critical conditions where we can, but we're very small, so we don't tend to do reactive work. We also look at whether the zoo that we work with can influence others. Do they have people within them that can influence other zoos, can influence the associations to have a wider impact? And it's not just the substandard zoos that we need to change. animal welfare advances are different around the world, and how the animal welfare is managed has an impact, obviously, on the animals. As a result of these advances in animal welfare, you'd think there would be improvements in the welfare of zoos and aquariums in the modern zoo community. But because of these differences in standards, the improvements seen in zoos and aquariums are not necessarily in tally with the known welfare advances. Equally, sometimes there's a potential welfare compromise within the accredited modern zoo community by appeasing a wider audience, because it can prevent those more experienced association bodies or institutions from perhaps taking that innovative step towards animal welfare care. The modern zoo community is good at sticking to what it knows, and it's very risk averse, and it's our job to try and challenge them on these practices, on these ingrained practices, and change the behaviours. Approaches to training and capacity development. Historically, it's been taken a standard approach. A survey of the facility is carried out, areas of concern are identified, and training is provided, and that might be exchange programs, paid for training, assessments, or specific training offers such as animal enrichment. So extensive efforts have gone into it, but we're still seeing significantly poor welfare, and why is that? Well, as I said earlier, the number of institutions is actually increasing, and there's simply not enough resources for us to help every single animal. Things get lost in translation. Translation is obviously a barrier in many areas, but also when it comes to training, a one-size-fits-all doesn't work for everybody, and that's where translation can act as a barrier. Sometimes there's no follow-up to any training, and then the main important one in regards to human behaviour is the hardware versus the software. What I mean by that is often substandard zoos are criticised and have poor welfare because of the lack of resources. But actually that's not necessarily the case. It's often because of the people and the software. And that's where the behaviour changes come in. But before we criticise those people, before we sort of say, why haven't you looking after the animals? Why have you got such apathy towards change? We have to remember that a lot of these people that we're working with have very small salaries, if a salary at all sometimes, are illiterate, have very lack of education. They have no incentive to change. So us going in there and just telling them to improve is not really going to work. Barriers to change. I'm going to talk about these two a lot more, the animal welfare as a concept and welfare measures. Also, other barriers to change are working with such a variety of different species and the fact that they're wild species. Cultural differences, facility animal ownership, as I've previously mentioned, and education levels are also limiting factors. But these ones are really out of our control. And it's these ones, the animal welfare as a concept and how we use that, and the welfare measures that we use to measure animal welfare that's within our control and we can use to create that change. Animal welfare, it's really complex, actually. It's a concept that's had a diversity of definitions. It's very difficult, really, to define. Perceptions of it change over time, globally variable, and are culturally sensitive. And as a result, there are many different ways that welfare is interpreted and consequently managed, resulting in varying standards of welfare. Behavioural approaches will only happen if there's a true understanding of what animal welfare is. And therefore, our challenge is providing an approach that creates an environment where keepers can truly understand what positive welfare means to the animals in their care. Just giving an example, it's quite easy with these two images to see that there's probably the animal is suffering. It's very poor animal welfare. It gets a little more complex when you see these images. Some people believe that human-animal or animal-animal interactions or training absolutely constitutes good welfare, no doubt on that. Some people believe that if they love their animal, that's enough, that's good welfare, and we all know that with their pets. We've seen an arthritic, chronic, obese pet, but they're loved, and the owner doesn't understand that the animal is suffering, and that happens in zoos. And that can be very confusing when the substandard zoos are wanting to emulate what goes on in the modern zoo community, and they're getting this contradictory approach to how animals should be cared for, and that often then leads to that depression in animal welfare. So how do we tackle these differences? Well, animal welfare, looking at it from the emotions and sentience perspective. Ideas have evolved in the last couple of decades, and increasing emphasis is on emotions and affective states of animals. And I'm sure you're all aware of the 5-domain model of animal welfare assessment, which looks at the 4 physical domains and then how they affect the mental state, which is the affective state, which is both positive and negative emotions. Charles Darwin actually talked about animal consciousness back in, 1872, but it was largely ignored for many, many years after that. And often emotions were described even in humans as chaotic or disorganized. But there is a biological purpose to these emotions. They're designed to move us along a course of actions, and pleasurable emotions derive from activities that often increase our survival, and equally non-pleasurable emotions will be often the opposite. I've heard people talking about anthropomorphism, and excuse me because I find the word very hard to say, so I'll try not to repeat it too much. But we've been accused with the use of the word, using of emotional language when we're talking about animal welfare as anthropomorphizing. But actually it's also been described as critical anthropomorphism, basically using your own human intuition and feelings and understandings as that starting point for then understanding the animals that you care for. Oh. That's different to my title. So animals, what motivates us? So animals are just like us. They're individuals just like you and I. And they have the same motivations, really, as you and I. Your emotions influence your behavior. Their emotions influence their behavior. Your individual preferences here in this room will influence your behavior right now. And it's the same with them. And getting keepers to understand that these animals have these similar emotions can help them understand their needs a lot better and hopefully help towards the care they're providing. So basically we're talking about empathy and creating that connection. Why bother, you might ask, when we're working with people who are illiterate and quite frankly quite often just want to get out of the room in the classroom? They're not interested. We could much more easily just show them, right, feed them, water them. No, that's all right, their welfare would be a little better. Well, by creating that empathetic connection, you're more likely to have a long-term change in behaviour. It's been shown that empathy in clinical care can really help with post-care and post-operative care, and empathy deficiency can cause a depression in that care. Human-animal interactions from farmers and their cattle, if they have a positive empathetic connection, that's linked to positive known animal welfare indicators such as milk yield or mastitis indices. And there's also empathy was found to be the best predictor of how people predict pain in their dogs. So empathy helps breed compassion and understanding, and people act on the things that they care about and understand. But I think most importantly, with empathy, by using an approach that addresses the emotional capacity of animals, we're also respecting the emotional capacity and intelligence of the people that we're working with. So despite a language barrier, despite a lack of education, it's giving them credit where it's most likely deserved, and it's giving them an opportunity to connect with the animals in a different way. I'm just going to skip that one. So, cracking the code, and what I mean by that is, first of all, we as the trainers have to understand what the frustrations or the needs and the motivations are of the people that we're working with. Zoo animals are much harder to work with than pets in terms of creating that connection. They often change. There's no contact, or there shouldn't be any contact with zoo animals. And there's very little experience or expertise going on, so they don't have the confidence to think of innovative ways to work with these animals. And as a result, there's very little incentive to connect with the animals. And our role is to install that incentive and connect with the animals through motivational, participatory, and relative training that will install those behaviour changes in the keepers and those long-term behaviour changes. We start by embedding empathy and compassionate values, and we do this by identifying firstly, or relating the animals to the people. So we identify what our emotions or their emotions are, and how they relate to our own actions. We'll then demonstrate key similarities between humans and non-humans, and identify those similarities in the animals that the people we're teaching, they care for. We'll then quantify it, so we'll basically identify what's relative, what do we prioritise, what is easy to change and what isn't, so it's easier for them to see a difference. And we provide empathy-based welfare measures that are applicable but also relatable to what we're describing beforehand. And then most importantly, we demonstrate how simple changes in their behaviours can actually make large differences to the animals. Everybody wants success, everybody wants to see things happen, and they want to know that they've done a good job. So we try and demonstrate that these small changes can actually make a difference. We don't try and make it too hard for them. So I'm going to give you an example, feeding and nutrition. Traditionally, when you train, you're going to talk about why nutrition is important to health and welfare. And you're also going to talk about the importance of presenting food in an appropriate way for that species' behavioural needs. You might talk about why it's satisfying, why it meets the species' needs, but do they still really understand what that means unless you're putting it into the context and relate it to their own feelings? So what we do is we split the group into two, and we'll split them down in half, and we'll provide one with a selection of food, or beer sometimes, if you don't think it's going to get too rowdy, that they can eat and drink, and where they can talk whenever they want, they can eat whenever they want, so basically they can have a good time. And then we provide the other group with one item, and we say that they must choose how they consume it. They're not allowed to talk, though, and they have to consume it in a certain time period. And after we've done that for about 15 minutes, we'll talk to them and identify the emotions that each group felt and why. We'll talk about socialization, taste, whether it tasted nice, whether they didn't like it, the fact that they had choice, the fact that they could choose what to eat. And as you can imagine, you generally get a group which is in a huff and frustrated and thinks it's a stupid game, and then you get the other group who thinks it's brilliant. We then talk about a particular species in the zoo. So, for example, we'll say the tiger, and we'll say that sometimes zoos, although they're receiving appropriate nutritional care, it can actually compromise their welfare. For example, the way they're being fed here. And we'll ask them to talk about the potential emotions that they think a tiger might have when it's looking for its food. So everything to do with stalking the prey, chasing the prey, catching it, eating it, and generally feeling pretty damn satisfied once it's eaten it. We'll ask them again to think about the emotions that that animal and that tiger feels, and we might put them into the same groups. And it's quite interesting because we find with the group that was given lots of food, they're much more colourful with their emotions, they're much more forthcoming with what they think, whereas the other group probably is still in a bit of a huff with us. But again, we can demonstrate how those different emotions come out with animals. If you're not feeding the animal correctly, it's going to be bored, it's going to be frustrated. So they start relating those feelings that they're feeling to the animals that they care for. And then we always go out and do a practical care where we can, so they can feel it, they can do it. They can see it actually easy or easier. It's not as hard as they thought it would be to provide for the animal's needs. So we might hang something very high for the tiger to chase. We might just put a scent in, just deodorant sprayed around the tiger's enclosure, and seeing that animal look and search. And it's amazing how you find them becoming much more interested in what their animal is doing that they care for, when usually they just walk straight by. A second example is that we challenge traditional training methods of welfare assessment. There isn't really no simple way of measuring welfare. In part, that's because we're not quite sure necessarily what we're always measuring. And we often relied on indicators that have usually been a secondary effect rather than primary cause. So we're looking at health indicators. And medical management means that that's quite often shaped husbandry management at the compromise of animal welfare in zoos. And training then has often reflected those measures. But focusing on numerical measures during training can disconnect the carer. They suddenly just see a bunch of numbers and they don't really understand what that's about. But how can you quantify effectively the unquantifiable? How can you say that animal is happy or satisfied? It's pretty hard. So we look at incorporating outcome-based assessments alongside the prescribed standards. And what we mean by that is prescribed measures would be enclosure size, if it's got a pool, has it got species-specific infrastructure in its enclosure. And then outcome-based measures would be, can it actually chase up a pole? Can it feed how it would like to feed? Has it got a place to hide away? Can it socialize? And you think of the behaviors and the emotions that that animal might want during those measures. As an example, we'll give either two videos or two different images, and here's one of chimps in a fake termite mound trying to find their food, and this one is our chimps, it's a still from a video being fed, and actually the chimps were clapping and doing begging behaviour for that food, which is inappropriate. And we'll ask them to rate the action or the feeling within those two different images. And just some examples here, whether it's feeding sated, it's full. Is it being allowed to do problem solving? Is it just clean and easy to do, which actually a lot of them rate as very high, and that's when we know we've got to go back. Is it satisfying, the food taste? Interactions while they're eating, if that's important for that particular species. Is it pleasurable or is it fun? We are using language like fun because we want them to relate to themselves when they eat. Do they enjoy eating with their friends, or do they enjoy eating actually on their own? And is it nutritionally important? We've still got to keep those parameters within it. We'll then carry out a practical welfare assessment that encourages participants to think about how the animals may feel. It is really basic. It has to be basic. We don't want to confuse them. We don't want to complicate matters, otherwise they just wander off. And we do ask things like, why is it important to provide food in a way that's behaviourally appropriate? Is it easier to feed them? It's more fun for the animals. It's good for their health. And actually, you probably maybe even sometimes want all of those ticked because it should be easier to feed them if you're feeding them appropriately. And then we'll repeat question 1 again and see if the results have changed. I'll just skip through that because I know the time's nearly up. So really evaluation, it starts with what we're doing. It starts with connecting with the participants. We review their issue from their position, and we identify the common similarities that we might have and realistic solutions that we might be able to provide. So we're basically trying to identify what's possible under the given circumstances. We'll then connect with the participants with the animals. So we'll look at positive welfare as a concept for them and the animals, and relate their welfare state with an animal's potential welfare state, and improvements are beneficial to both. Then we'll do practical application, relatable and practical exercises, easy and self-evaluate, and the goal is that participants can relate practical exercises to their day-to-day work so they can see that it's possible. I'm just going to skip over that one and finish with this summary. Those are your topic you can read. The most important one really, and I know this has been mentioned before, is remembering behaviour changes don't happen overnight. And as an example, it took us 3 months to get a foraging box in a macaque enclosure in a zoo. And that's because we had to go through the government, who owned the zoo, the CEO, who didn't want it to look messy, the curator, who thought it'd be too much work, and the keepers, who didn't understand. But we wanted them to realise it was a good thing, because otherwise, as soon as we left, that foraging box would go. So it took us 3 months, but it's still there, and all the other macaques also have foraging boxes. So you can have some success with this way. And that's it, and I'm sorry I went so quickly. Thank you.